Hello everyone and welcome to our next episode of Called and Chosen, the series in which we're focusing not so much on the physical building of our churches, but of the men that God has called to serve within them, who have been called to serve as priests for our communities. Today we are very blessed to have been able to steal a little bit of time from one of our bishops here in San Antonio, Bishop Michael Boulette. He is one of my mentors. He was one of my pastors as my early part of my priesthood. And so as we begin today, Bishop, I want to say thank you for taking the time to be with us today and ask you just to kind of go into, if you'll introduce yourself a little bit and lead us into your vocation story.
It's great. I'll be happy to. My name is Michael Boulette. That means the last part of my name is French Canadian. I was born in upstate New York. And I have had an Italian mom and a French Canadian dad, and so the ambiente of my life was Catholic. We went to the St. Paul's Church side by side in the little town of Hudson Falls in New York. There was a church for French Canadian Catholics and a church for Irish Catholics, side by side with only an alley between the two. We both had schools, we both had separate convents for our nuns, and both of the priests were diocesan, but they didn't talk to each other very much, even though they lived side by side, and the Irish had a Monsignor, and we didn't. And so we were the less socioeconomic class than the Irish, who tended to be in charge of, there's a big GE plant there. Any case, I went to Catholic school, so that, my family was not the pillars of the church, as it were, but generally speaking, we went to Mass every Sunday with my mom. My dad was a little more tepid about whether or not he would go to church. But I was there, and I was an altar boy since I was 4 years old. As soon as you entered school, you were an altar boy, whether you made your first communion or not. And so there was a little army of altar servers at Mass every Sunday, and all of the nuns were there. I loved the liturgy. I loved the beauty of Mass. I loved being in that space. My family was a little bit troubled, but I don't think I was. And ultimately became a lot troubled, but I don't think I was going to church to escape that. There was just something very beautiful there, and something I really respected. But I know a lot of guys these days have a lot of trouble deciding whether or not they want to be a priest, and they go through all sorts of machinations about it, and discernment, which is all beautiful. But I never had that issue. I've just always known I was supposed to be a priest from my mother's womb. Exactly what that meant, it changed a lot. I can't say that I was super excited about it, because I really wanted a family, but I knew it was what God wanted. And so I set on that course. And it's actually the greatest gift God ever gave me, not the being of a priest, which is a very beautiful thing, but knowing what I was supposed to do. There was never any great trauma. I didn't have to decide this or that for the most part. And so I was just growing up in a Catholic school, and then my father decided to move us to Fredericksburg, Texas when I was 9 and in the 4th grade. And I moved from a pretty Catholic environment there to a pretty Catholic environment in Fredericksburg. So the transition for me personally was pretty smooth, even though I had to leave I've got tons of cousins and aunts and uncles there that we left behind. My godfather, who I adored. And, but so we went to Kerrville, and immediately Fredericksburg, and immediately I went to Catholic school. I started in the 4th grade there. Again, another beautiful set of women, nuns, who were our teachers, a school that was very engaged. I told when I was already an altar server, so their young men were becoming altar servers when they were in the 4th grade. So I was teaching my classmates the Latin that we used for Mass at the time, which I knew by heart because I've been doing it for so long. And then the associate pastor in the parish, it was a very German community out at that time in 1959. And the pastor was a German-American, Father Hildebrand, and the associate was Father Wunibald Schneider, who was from Germany directly. He had been a Salvadorian brother for many years, and he escaped Germany before Hitler took over and went to Ireland and continued his being a monk, a brother in his community. And then at some point he felt called to the priesthood, so he went to the seminary and and became a priest. And Archbishop Lucy recruited him to come to this country. And so anyway, he ended up pretty quickly as the associate. And I told him when I was in the 4th grade I was going to become a priest. Well, he then became my protector. I mean, he worked, he continued conversations with me about it, even as I was, essentially a child. He knew the struggles in my family, my father's addiction to alcohol, and, he sort of tried to protect me from that. Since we were Italian and French, there was probably 4 families in the entire parish that weren't German. And so he defended my honor as a non-German among the German people, which, of course, which was a good thing. I mean, he assisted, but then, you get your own decent reputation by your own participation in Mass and school and the like. So it just continued to affirm that this is what I was supposed to do. And so in the 8th grade, after I finished the 8th grade, there I graduated. There was a Catholic high school there at the time, but I didn't go on to it. I knew what I wanted to do, and I told my parents I wanted to go to St. John's Seminary, which was our high school boarding seminary at the time. I had been to a couple of workshops when they had week-long workshops for junior high students in the summertime. It's like going to camp, as it were, And for 2 years I had done that, so I knew something about the campus, and that was before the chapel was built. We'd used Mission Concepcion as our chapel. We would walk over there. St. John's was right close there. So I entered St. John's fully against my father's wishes. He put up a very strong fight. Mom was just trying to keep us alive, keep us going, all of that sort of thing. She didn't say I couldn't or I should. She said, you know what your conversation with God is. If you're called to be a priest, you go with my blessing. But my father objected, and it wasn't until the last minute that he signed the necessary papers. But in any case, I went in, and I had 4 really great years at St. John's Seminary. I know in these days, and when I tell people I was in a boarding school for 4 years, they kind of go, what a crazy idea. But I actually absolutely enjoyed it. First of all, once again, every one of our teachers was a religious, in this case, priest. They were all Vincentian priests. So I was taught by really wonderful people, men, as just in their own sense of themselves. And then all of them were, I mean, high school, and everybody has a minimum of a master's or a doctorate. We had one lay teacher, as we did in the other 2 schools. Well, in the first school, there was no lay teacher. Second one, there was a lay teacher, but at the seminary, there was only like 1. And then a couple of part-timers who came in to teach us things like health, or one wonderful Irish guy from Incarnate Word came over to teach us diction. It really helped. I would love for a whole bunch of the priests I know right now to listen to him for a while and try to learn how to open their mouth and use their lungs and so forth to project and all that kind of stuff. He was a drama guy, and he was just teaching. It was a wonderful experience, and I watched people grow and work with people's accents. Even though he had the strongest Irish brogue you can imagine, you could understand him perfectly because his diction was perfect. And he was inviting us to know what we would need one day in order to proclaim. Father Jim Katara, who is now south of town, was my classmate. So we've been together for 12 years in the seminary. Anyway, so I did 4 wonderful years there. In 1968, I graduated, came over to Assumption. Again, no difficulty about that. No, it was very much a calm. It was just the natural course of things. People who know me know I like to celebrate anniversaries. I like to look back and see what I've done or what others have done and so forth. I used to, and I lost this dictionary. My first year in high school, I had one of those blue Webster dictionaries, and in the cover, when I remember the first day of class, I put down freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and then back at the time, college was divided into first philosophy, second philosophy, first college, second college, first philosophy, second philosophy, and then 1, 2, 3 theologies. And every year I would scratch one of them off until I got ordained. It was like a calendar with the X's, I lost that dumb thing somewhere in one of my moves, but it was just, it's something I carried around. It's like, oh yeah, we're making progress, that sort of thing. So I went to Assumption, and I knew that I would be working with people, and I developed an interest also in psychology. So when we moved to Assumption, we did formation here, but we did our college at St. Mary's University. And so I enrolled there in psychology. It was a very upheaval year, 1968. There was a sort of a major rebellion going on in the Archdiocese of San Antonio against Archbishop Lucy. The seminary was in chaos, as it were. We went through 3 faculties in 18 months. One was when I went in, there was a very untraditional faculty there, really good men. They were wonderful, but they opposed many of the things that Archbishop Lucy was asking and doing. And so he relieved them of their command and brought in a pretty traditional faculty. And there needed to be a period of reconciliation. And several priests left the priesthood. I'm talking not a few, many. And many seminarians left the seminary at the time. In fact, in an 18-month period, we went from 180 students to 80 students. Pretty upheaval time, but again, I was focused. I saw it all happening, and part of it all happening, but it wasn't a trauma. There was no urge to leave or felt like the Holy Spirit was asking me to leave. No, it was just, this is what you do. I mean, sometimes you go through these sorts of things when you're on your journey for the Lord. And so I stayed happily and met some really good people who stayed lifelong friends. People who became priests became lifelong fellows on the journey. But I also really wanted to even learn more about how to deal with human relationships. And so I finished college in 3 years. And then while my classmates were in their 4th year of college, I went to Trinity University to get my master's in psychology. So again, I was being formed at Assumption, but I was going to school somewhere else. And so during that year period, I finished a master's degree in psychology. At the time, Father David Garcia, who was a year ahead of me, and I started asking the questions of ourselves. He had been in the high school seminary too, a year ahead of me, but still in school with me. And we said, we've heard a lot of our teachers, maybe it would be interesting if we could go to another theologate for a while and hear some other voices and so forth. And so we petitioned Archbishop Fury, who took the place of Archbishop Lucy, and who was a great reconciler of the church. I mean, I know he was sent here. He was from Philadelphia, but then he was a priest in Philadelphia, but he became the ordinary in San Diego. And from San Diego, he was called to San Antonio. And he was a, kind and tall fellow and gregarious and loved to be with people and all of that sort of thing. So we went to him and asked him if it was possible. He had called Archbishop Flores to become a bishop. In fact, he insisted that Rome ask him to be the auxiliary bishop of San Antonio. at the time. When a bishop is named, the people who's asking for a bishop have to send in 3 names, and so he only sent in 1 name first. He just sent Archbishop Flores' name, and they rejected it and said, "You need to give us 3 names." So he wrote down Flores, and sent it back. That's not a apocryphal story. That's really it really happened. And so anyway, they did name him, and Archbishop Flores became the first Mexican-American bishop in the United States in May of 70, I think it is. In any case, so Flores had a connection with Father Hesburgh, who was the president of Notre Dame University for years. And on this campus of the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, there's a seminary. It's called Moreau Seminary, and the Holy Cross Fathers send their men there to be formed while they go to school at Notre Dame. And during this period of time, this was the early 70s, and probably for about a 20-year period, they allowed a certain number of diocesan seminarians to join the community, and they had a separate person in charge, a diocesan priest in charge of the formation of those seminarians. So Fury agreed to let us go. There was a couple of things we had to do. The first is we had to figure out how to pay for it ourselves. And second, and that's no small trick if you're going to the University of Notre Dame. The second thing is that we had to stay with our first year of theology here in San Antonio at Assumption and Oblate School of Theology, so that we would get to know our classmates, and that we could leave in our second year. So Father David, a year ahead of me, he left first. Now, neither one of us had the financial resources, nor did our families, to send us to the University of Notre Dame. So Bishop Flores called Father Hesburgh, who was the president of the university for at least 30 years, and asked a favor. And Hesburgh gave us full scholarships. And not just full scholarships tuition, full scholarships to Moreau as well. So the diocese, neither the diocese nor Father David and I had to pay any money for our formation there. So each of us spent 2 years there. Back in those days, it's different now, it was 3 years of study and then 1 year in the parish. Your diaconate year was spent in the parish. In fact, there's some talk about going back to that, but in any case, that's what the situation was then. So I did 2 more years of theology at Notre Dame, finished there, had a great time. The winter really bothered me for the first semester, but then I had to realize I had to get used to it. It wasn't going to change, and so I started making friends with the cold, at least acquaintances with the cold, and enjoyed it. And so we had lectures from people all over the world. I mean, it was just a wonderful location where people come in, and the classes were good. And in fact, the number of classes I had to take was lighter than ever, than I was doing, as I was cramming all these courses in so I could get all these degrees along the way. Notre Dame's schedule was light comparatively, but more intense. The classes were more intense. But I had a wonderful time there, and some beautiful people that became lifelong friends. Priests in other dioceses around the country now because of it. And so it was great. In the transition time when I was finishing my master's degree in psychology, before I entered the theologate, there was a little bit of a temptation not to continue in the priest, very small, and only because my psychology professors really appreciated my work, and they really said, "We will finance your PhD in psychology if you will continue." But I did a little bit of thinking about it. You can't ignore the offer.
Yeah.
So I brought it to prayer and spiritual direction, and realized, it was possible to be a priest and a full-time psychologist. We have several examples of that, but not really to be a diocesan priest and do that. And so you have to join a religious community. And I was pretty much wedded to the counties of of San Antonio and the Hill Country, and so I didn't pursue that. And I didn't ask anybody to pursue it. I just said, no, that's really not what God wants for me to do. I think the fact that I have a minimum adventuresome spirit, I think that's what the psychological tests say. I don't have a very large adventuresome spirit. I don't like roller coasters. I wouldn't be bungee jump for the life of me. I fly because I must. I don't think I would be a great missionary in the jungles of some country or whatever. It's just sort of not me. It's not like looking for comfort. It's just the discomfort of not knowing the culture and all of that.
Yeah.
Seems to speak something inside of me. In any case, become a missionary in this territory instead of for the world, as it were. So I had a wonderful time, and then I moved. I was ordained a deacon here at Assumption a year and a half, well, maybe 14 months before I was ordained a priest. I was ordained in the chapel here, Our Lady's Chapel, in January, I think it was January 12th of 1975. It was a bitter, cold, and icy morning. All of our classmates were ordained, and of course, together, there was several of us from various dioceses, maybe 9 of us. And we couldn't really invite a lot of people because the chapel only held 200 people, maybe. So my mom and my brother were able to come, and in spite of the ice and so forth. But it was a wonderful day. I remember it beautifully. The day I promised to be celibate, the day I received orders for the first time. And immediately I went back to Notre Dame for the last semester, and for the second semester. And there I worked at the Basilica, Sacred Heart Basilica on campus. I became the deacon for the liturgies there, and enjoyed that. I was actually the deacon for our baccalaureate mass in their major deal for graduation that May.
Yeah.
Then my rector here at Assumption, Father Ed Bealey, was going to be leaving as rector, and he was going to be taking a parish. Little unbeknownst to me, he was going to take me with him wherever he went, but he wasn't sure where he was going. And so no one would ever tell me where I was going, because it had been, all my classmates knew they were going, but I didn't know, and I kept writing it. So where am I going? He would write some back, don't worry about it, we'll have something for you. But I didn't know that he was going to take me with him. So he had 2 parishes that they were debating, and he ended up going to St. James and Sacred Heart in Gonzales, and St. Patrick's in Welder, the mission. And so I joined him. So I spent, I was there for 8 months as a deacon. And then on March the 19th, 1976, the Feast of St. Joseph, in Fredericksburg, Texas, my home, Archbishop, by this time, Archbishop Flores had replaced Archbishop Fury, who passed away relatively young. In fact, I'm going to be buried next to him someday. I just tagged a space next to him at Holy Cross Cemetery here. The guy who ordained me, and I'm going to be next to him. Anyway, Archbishop Flores I was there in Gonzales for almost 4 years. Almost 5 years. That's when I got assigned, when I came back in 1976, after I was ordained. I was there in Gonzales for 8 months as a deacon, and then on March the 19th, I was ordained in Fredericksburg. Archbishop Flores permitted us to be ordained in our hometowns, and so he would travel around. So there's like 6 ordinations he went to in various cities, and I thought it was a wonderful vocational thing. The tradition now is much more connected to, well, you're a priest for the whole diocese, so we do it in the diocesan church, which is the cathedral, and I understand, but it was a glorious day for me in Fredericksburg.
Yes.
It was a wonderful German festival, dance, and, a glorious spring day, and all of that. And so, and at that Mass, it was announced that I was going to be able to stay in Gonzales. So I stayed another total of 4 years and 8 months. in Gonzales. Then I got a call from Archbishop Flores one day, and he asked me to go to St. Anne's in San Antonio. The pastor there was a wonderful guy, but associates kept leaving him, and so he asked me to go, and I still had another like 6 months on my tenure there, and I said, well, why don't you send me after I finish my tenure? And he said, well, I'd really like you to go now, so I went now. And so I came to St. Anne's in San Antonio, and I had a wonderful experience because the pastor, Joe Dean, was one of the most prayerful and missionary spirited. He was from Ireland, and assiduously working for the people. I mean, you know, his day off was to pray for his people. I mean, he would be in his room praying. His vacation was just to go home to Ireland, you know. And he would work 12 years. He's still alive. He's in retirement in the Austin Diocese now. He would work for 12 years in a parish, and then he would take a year sabbatical and go back to Ireland and be with his family, and then come back and work like a crazy for another 12 years. He did that. That was his pattern. He did marvelously. But it was a wonderful. We're still close. We call each other and write and stuff like that. And then I was there for about 40 months, and Monsignor Steuben called and said, I want you to come join me on the faculty at Assumption as Director of Spiritual Formation and Liturgy. So I thought, okay. I was pretty young, and I was only 7 years ordained. But I figured it was, okay, let's give it a shot, you know. So I came, and I had a great spiritual director myself, so I learned a lot from him. He was a monk. And then, so I continued my formation as a spiritual director, and then created a program of spiritual formation for the seminary. I wrote a book called The Word Made Flesh, and I still have copies of it. It was basically the program for 3 years for the 3 years of formation in the seminary. And I wrote that with my monk friend and spiritual director. And I was there for almost 10 years. Every year was a little different. First, Monsignor Steuben led the way for the first half of the time I was there, and then he got asked to be the Vicar General and to lead the papal visit in 1987. In September of 1987, Larry asked me to be in charge of the hospitality and feeding of the Holy Father and his entourage. So I spent 18 months back. You know, they don't take that long to do these things anymore, but back then this was sort of a major novelty with Pope John Paul II, and we spent 18 months working on it. We knew 18 months in advance he was coming. And so we had to raise a lot of money, and Larry asked me to be in charge of these things, so I had to raise the money for all the food. Actually, I did, and with Rosemary Kowalski from Catering by Rosemary, and Michael and Carol Staling from Takasita at the time. They've sold the company. They now run Mama Margie's, but he helped me to get the financing together, and Rosemary helped me get the organization together. And we did 24 events in 23 locations in 22 hours.
You became a caterer.
That's right. That's what we did. But I didn't get to go to any of the other events except what happened at the seminary. I had to stay and take care of the people and make sure things were ready for the next thing that was going to happen here on this campus. It was wonderful, but I got that in the consequence. I was very close to John Paul for 22 hours, you know. You know, I stayed out all night long outside of his door, his bedroom door, with his guards from the Vatican, and we were conversing in pidgin Italian and pidgin Spanish. They didn't know, I didn't know Italian, and they didn't know English, and so we were, you know, I got some coins. I lived in my office. I got some coins from them, and we exchanged change in our pockets and we exchanged some medallions and things like that. It was fun. And but that night, at the end of the visit, he was supposed to have dinner with just the Archbishop, Auxiliary Bishop Pop at the time, and his secretary, Monsignor Zivich, who is now the retired Archbishop, Cardinal Archbishop of Warsaw. Anyway, they were supposed to have dinner together, and when I was in the kitchen with Rosemary getting ready to serve the table, Monsignor Zivich came in and said, "The Holy Father invites you to join us for dinner." So I got to have dinner with the Holy Father. Yeah. And that was a really good experience. I was probably too young to enjoy the privilege because I didn't just sit quietly. I asked a lot of questions. And Father Monsignor Zivich finally made it clear that I ought to be less vocal. How often is a priest going to sit with the Pope?
Exactly.
Especially in the 80s. And you know me, I'm not going to pass up the chance. So there I was. Anyway, so I had a wonderful time after, and then a transition of leaders was, of leadership. We went to Jerry Barnes, Father Jerry Barnes, who became the ordinary of San Bernardino, but so there was a transition there. And both wonderful men to work for. Wonderful, joyful life that I've had. And then I moved to, after that, I took a sabbatical and got my doctorate in preaching and worship. Amazingly, no Catholic university in the entire country offered a doctorate in preaching. Wow. So I had to go to a Protestant university. I went to Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary and finished my doctorate, which I've been working on, but and then I took a sabbatical and wrote my dissertation. And then after that I was assigned, I thought I was going to teach, but all of a sudden, actually even before I took the sabbatical, before they sealed the deal, Archbishop Flores asked me to go to Kerrville. There were some difficulties there, and he asked me to go there, and I said, I'll never finish this degree. If I go, I know me, I'll get involved in the parish, and I'll never finish it. Allow me to do this, let the associate take care of it, or let somebody else go for a little while, and then you can decide, but I won't finish this degree because I know I'll get involved. So they named me associate pastor, administrator, and I finished my degree, and 1 week after I defended my dissertation, I was back as pastor. I was there as pastor, and then I had 12 fabulous years in a row as the pastor. And during the second term, I was wondering what was next, and I started, with spiritual direction I'd been doing in the seminary. So I had a large clientele of spiritual directees, even while I was a pastor. And so I said, what's next? And the Acts movement was on charge. Crucio was big. So all these people were coming back from these things all on fire, but there weren't enough spiritual directors to work with them to go further, and lots of priests didn't feel equipped to do it. And so I asked, can we go forward? So I got permission to found a spiritual direction center. A benefactrix, Beverly Peavy House from Midland, Texas, who was a grandmother of one of my people in my school there, supported it, and I founded St. Peter upon the Water. I did that exclusively for 6 years. It's in Ingram, Texas, 8 miles from Kerrville. Then I came back as pastor for another 6 years doing both. So I was overall 18 years, and overall in the county 24 years.
Then you get an interesting phone call.
Archbishop Gustavo told me I could go back and do St. Peter upon the Water exclusively, but he knew what he was doing, because a few months later I got a phone call telling me that the Holy Father had named me auxiliary bishop of San Antonio. And so for the last 5 years and a couple of days, I was ordained on the same day that I was ordained a priest, Feast of St. Joseph. 5 years ago, I was named. auxiliary bishop, and there are many wonderful things about being a bishop, and a few not so great, but they've never stopped my enthusiasm for being a priest. And I've talked way too long. So
that's okay. That's okay. Well, the good thing about this video is it gives people that little bit of a chance to really get to know who Bishop Michael Boulette is. Now, the one question I had, a lot of your formation, your growth as a person was with religious orders, with the Holy Cross Brothers, with the Vincentians. And you mentioned it a little bit that there's a difference between choosing that religious life and choosing to be a diocesan. And I wonder if you'd go into a little bit more detail, a little bit more explaining how that evolution begins, or how we kind of make that decision.
Yeah, well, the principal difference between a diocesan priest and a religious order priest is the territory. When you become a diocesan priest, you are now, as it were, married to the church of that area. And therefore, the obedience and respect that you offer is to whoever the ordinary is, the bishop of that diocese is. When you're religious, you are open to be a missionary. In other words, there is no boundaries. The only boundary is the mission of the order that you belong. And each of them have different charisms. Each of them have different gifts that they emphasize on. So, and then you also must therefore also be willing to always live in a community of fellow priests. Our community is called the presbytery. That is, it's the gathering of the priests around the bishop, but it's a different sort of gathering. And so we do not take the vow of poverty as religious do, so that we must gather, we must, save our money and that sort of thing. And therefore we have a sort of independent control in many ways of our lives, always in obedience and respect to the Archbishop. So the difference is being connected to a territory or being connected to a specific charism of a group of people and their founder who are willing to go beyond the local place where they were born.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, you also mentioned that you were able to be very intimately involved with JP2's visit. My family always has joked I was there, but I was right under a year old. But if there was one story or thought that this just has stuck with me this whole time, and it may have been the dinner you already mentioned, but was there one of those encounters or stories or things you've witnessed?
Well, yes. First of all, the incredible additional respect that I was able to offer, although I offered a lot of it before, when I saw him in person. That is, he was the most humble person in the entire entourage of his 40 people. I mean, the cardinals, were all oftentimes puffed up birds, but he was absolutely humble. He was at 4 o'clock in the morning, he was up already in chapel praying. And, I was there with him, or right outside, not with him, as it were, but prayerful. And he had gone to bed at, late. I mean, he must be very tired, but he was a prayerful person, absolutely prayerful person, and humble person. I had to clean his room, and I walked into the bathroom after he had gone, of course, and he had his kit for his toiletries. And it looked like it had been using it since he was a seminarian. I mean, it was falling apart. And I really wanted to go buy him a new one. I mean, they wouldn't let me off campus, secret surveillance. But if I had known him, but he would have probably given it to somebody else. I mean, it was like things didn't matter. And so that was a beautiful, warm experience of knowing that this person was in this for God and not for himself.
Yes. I think he made a deep impact on our diocese when he made that visit.
Absolutely. We've been reaping the spiritual rewards of that for many years.
Yes. We have one priest we recently interviewed who I made sure he made sure as part of his video. He was there also, but he was handing out anti-Catholic propaganda.
Right.
And then now he's one of our pastors in our diocese and a great priest.
Right.
But even for my family, because I grew up in Santa Maria, Texas, and there's a plaque on the seminary wall of the people of Santa Maria packed up to come see the Polish Pope.
Sure.
But there's a picture at the hemisphere for the visit where the Pope is reaching into the crowd. He shakes hands with a woman. That woman was my grandmother. And even when she developed Alzheimer's and dementia, she couldn't remember who I was or my grandfather or anybody. She remembered JP2's hands because she worked a farm, did cotton and everything else. Her hands were calloused and rough. How soft his hands were was the memory. Even Alzheimer's dementia couldn't take that away from her. It made an impact for her.
Super. Yeah, one of the great side gifts of doing this visit was that I got to introduce my mother to him. Father Steuben had arranged it so that, my senior Steuben had arranged it so that when he departed from buildings, there would be a line of benefactors or people who were close to the situation, and his mother and my mother were able to meet him, and I've got fabulous pictures of my mom glowing. Her face was alive.
I could only imagine the excitement she had.
She never, it was a moment that shaped, in many ways, the rest of her life.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you so much for this time together and the interview together.
Well, I'm very grateful for you joining us. And maybe if just one last little thing I'll ask you to do for the video, if there was anyone who is watching, usually these videos aren't going to be watched by those who are actually discerning.
Right.
But we have family members, we have friends that we're thinking about, maybe they could be a priest. If you would give just a little bit of practical advice, one or two things for them to consider, or what they should be looking for that next priest from either their family, their friends, what should they be looking for?
Well, first of all, people who like people, and that are able to learn, that they want to learn more about God, that they're interested in the whole idea of God and the church. People who love Mass, love the Eucharist, love the experience of Jesus. And I say to family members, don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to bring it up. Don't be afraid to continue to bring it up if you continue to see the spark there, the possible interest in them, and also listen to God yourself, so that you can, with God, discern that you should ask this person that. And then after someone has expressed some interest, encourage. Don't say, "Oh no, you can't do that," or whatever. Encourage them to find out. Encourage them to continue hearing, and to continue to listen to the voice of God.
Oh, that's awesome. I do want to thank everyone who's going to be tuning in for this episode. And like I've said, every single one of our episodes, I encourage you. Bishop Mike has mentioned some of the priests that helped form his vocation, and I'm sure we could probably spend another 30 minutes talking about all those priests. But I encourage for all of you, those priests that have impacted your faith and your family, living or deceased, comment them in our comments so that we can keep them in prayer. But also it's a way for us to remember to reflect. Who is going to fill their shoes? Who is going to be that next priest to make that impact in your children's life, your grandkids' life? Who is going to bring the sacramental life to them? It's worth us reflecting on, because that next generation is out there, and it's worth us asking them and inviting them to be a priest. So I do want to thank you all for tuning in. I want to thank Bishop for taking the time. I know your schedule is crazy busy, but I appreciate the time, and thank you for visiting. And instead of usually just closing like we have, would you be willing to give us a blessing?
Sure. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
And may the blessing of Almighty God, Father and Son and Holy Spirit come upon us and remain with us forever and ever.
Amen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being a part of watching this vocation video series, and we're excited that you took time to do so. God has a call for each and every one of us, and maybe God is calling you to be a priest or a religious brother or sister. So don't be afraid. God's love is with you, and God will give you the strength to answer that call. If you'd like to speak with me or anyone in the vocation office, or you seek further information, go to our social media. San Antonio Vocations, or just simply look us up, Google us, and you'll find the information, and we'll get information to you as quickly as possible. God bless you, and God be with you.